I was scrolling through a clinical psychology syllabus the other day, and, if you didn't know any better, you'd think the story of the Asian American and Pacific Islander experience was written entirely in the ink of struggle.
Mm-hmm.
The pages are just so heavy with terms like acculturative stress, intergenerational trauma, and marginalization.
Right. The deficit model.
Exactly. It paints this picture of a community that's defined almost exclusively by what has been done to them, a collection of risk factors and pathologies just waiting to be mitigated.
Yeah, you'd expect to find people just completely weighed down by it.
You would.
Yeah.
But then you step into a different space and the whole narrative just flips. I remember observing a community gathering where the air didn't feel heavy at all. It felt electric.
I know that feeling.
There's a specific Filipino word, Kapwa, which describes a collective sense of being, this idea that your soul and mine are fundamentally connected.
A shared self.
In that room, the trauma from the textbooks, it didn't disappear, but it wasn't the protagonist anymore. Instead, there was this fierce, quiet determination called Ganbat, a brand of grit that doesn't just ask you to stick with it, but to radically transform the very structures that caused the stress in the first place.
That's such a striking contradiction.
It is. On one hand, the formal academic world often views these communities through a lens of deficit and, the raw deal. But on the other, there is this vibrant, sophisticated logic of solidarity that treats community not as a burden, but as a protective shield. Why does our mainstream understanding of mental health so often focus on the wound while ignoring the cultural DNA that actually heals it? And if these strengths are so powerful, why are the scholars who discover them so often left off the syllabus?
And that's the core contradiction we're getting into.
That is the core contradiction we are diving into today. Our sources, they lay out the high cost of all this external pressure, but also the enduring strengths-based cultural logic that allows communities to not just survive, but to persist and thrive despite those costs.
Right.
So our mission is clear. We're going to use a hard scientific concept, evolutionary mismatch, to frame the intense external stressors faced by marginalized communities, particularly Asian American and Pacific Islanders.
Okay.
Then we'll analyze the adaptive significance of two powerful cultural persistence mechanisms, the tenacious grit of Ganbat and the collective soul of Kapwa.
And then connect it all to the modern research.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We'll connect these internal strengths to modern research that reveals the incredibly complex psychological role of ethnic identity, proving that even a protective shield isn't always uniform or unconditional. We want to understand not just what causes the strain, but what specifically allows for the deep fundamental resilience.
It's an essential shift in perspective. I mean, for too long, the psychological discussion around marginalized populations has focused on the negative adaptations, the trauma, the stress, the pathology.
Right.
But when we look at the evolutionary basis of stress, we realize that the human body and mind are currently operating under a profound scientific disadvantage. A disadvantage that gets amplified for immigrant and minority groups.
Okay.
If we understand that external context as a form of evolutionary mismatch, it becomes so much clearer why these modern stressors are so taxing.
Okay, let's unpack this concept of evolutionary mismatch.
Yeah.
It implies that our bodies and brains are built for a world that simply doesn't exist anymore.
Precisely. In evolutionary biology, mismatch theory is a powerful explanation for why modern humans suffer from an array of chronic physical and psychological ailments. It posits that a trait or adaptation that was highly advantageous in an ancestral environment suddenly becomes maladaptive or harmful because the environment changed too rapidly.
So it's about the speed.
It's all about the speed. You have to remember the time scale. Natural selection is incredibly slow. It operates over countless generations to optimize our fitness for a given environment.
And human advancement technology, agriculture, societal complexity is moving at warp speed relative to that natural selective process.
Exactly. Since the Neolithic Revolution, and especially since the Industrial Age, human advancement has just accelerated exponentially. Our physical and psychological software is running on ancestral code that's thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of years old.
Evolution just can't keep up.
It can't. This results in a temporary period of what you could call disequilibrium or catching up, and this mismatch can manifest in two major ways.
Temporal and spatial, if I recall from the material.
Correct. Temporal mismatch is gradual. The environment changes slowly over time, leading to outdated adaptations persisting. But what's highly relevant to the experience of immigrant and marginalized populations is spatial mismatch.
Okay, so that's different.
It's a sudden, radical change in environment caused by migration moving a population whose cultural and biological adaptations were optimized for one place into a completely alien new one.
And all their established mechanisms for survival
Suddenly confront a radically different societal structure. The disequilibrium is massive and immediate.
that completely reframes the immigrant experience or the experience of any group thrust into a dominant culture that wasn't built for them. It's not a failure of the individual to adapt.
It's a predictable failure of the environment to align with evolved human nature.
So what does this look like in the most basic biological sense? Let's start with that famous example, the thrifty gene.
The thrifty gene hypothesis is the perfect illustration of a metabolic mismatch. For our hunter-gatherer ancestors, life was characterized by cycles of feast or famine.
Right. Food wasn't guaranteed.
Not at all. So it was crucial for survival and reproductive success to have genes that made the body extremely efficient at storing excess energy as visceral fat whenever food was abundant. This trait, this thrifty gene, was intensely selected for because it directly correlated with surviving lean times. Those who stored energy efficiently passed on their genes. Those who didn't starved.
It was literally a life-saving mechanism. But now it's contributing to some of our biggest global health crises.
Precisely. We live in a world of sedentary lifestyles and hyper-palatable, calorie-dense, and often nutrient-deficient processed foods. The environment has fundamentally changed, but our genetic wiring has not.
So that old instruction to store everything.
It misfires dramatically. This mismatch leads directly to the epidemics of obesity, insulin resistance, and type 2 diabetes. Our hormonal systems designed to manage scarcity are just overwhelmed by constant abundance.
I see.
For example, hormones like leptin, which signals that you're full, can stop functioning effectively because they're constantly being flooded in a high-calorie environment. That leads to leptin resistance.
So the body thinks it's starving even while it's gaining weight. I am struck by the fact that the very mechanism designed for survival in one environment is now the primary cause of chronic disease in another. If that's true for the body, it must be exponentially true for the brain, which is far more sensitive to environmental inputs.
Oh, absolutely.
So how does this mismatch manifest as psychological stress or anxiety?
This is where we get into behavioral mismatch. The brain of our ancestors evolved for an immediate return environment.
Immediate return. What does that mean?
Think about fear. If a predator, a saber-toothed tiger, appeared, the fear response would trigger an immediate high-stakes physical action. Fight, flight, or freeze. The resolution was quick, immediate, and definite. Either you achieved safety or you died. Anxiety, as an acute psychological response, was an efficient short-term mechanism to ensure survival.
But the stressors of modern life rarely offer that immediate closure.
Modern life is defined by a delayed reaction environment. We're no longer stressed by immediate predators, but by highly abstract, future-oriented threats. Mortgage payments, career longevity, social status on digital platforms, global stability.
And there's no running away from a mortgage.
Exactly. Our ancestral anxiety system, which demands immediate resolution, is now constantly focused on these delayed threats. It just fires chronically. Since there's no physical action that resolves the problem, the anxiety lingers.
Wow.
This chronic activation is incredibly taxing. It leads to the sustained release of stress hormones like cortisol and contributes to chronic low-grade inflammation, which we now know is heavily linked to psychiatric disorders like depression and general anxiety disorder.
So the mechanism is working perfectly.
But it's applied to the wrong time frame and the wrong type of threat.
That makes profound sense. The body is always preparing for a sprint that never gets run. And the sources connect this directly to the structure of society itself, specifically the modern workplace.
The modern workplace is perhaps the most unnatural environment humans have ever created. Our ancestors lived in small bands, often fewer than 150 individuals, that were relatively egalitarian.
And work was integrated with life.
Yes, and labor had immediate visible returns. Work was meaningful because it led directly to food or shelter.
Contrast that with today's corporate structure.
Today, we operate in vast, complex, rigidly hierarchical organizations. We're driven by extrinsic motivations, abstract financial rewards, rather than the intrinsic reward of immediate survival.
It's a completely different system.
And the modern structure exploits our evolved psychological mechanisms for survival, status, and affiliation. For example, our drive for high social status, which was once tied to communal contribution, is now exploited by career ladders that are fundamentally zero-sum and require constant competition.
Right.
The result is chronic work stress, burnout, and profound job alienation, precisely because the environment is so dramatically mismatched with the small group, egalitarian context our social instincts evolved in.
So if that modern, Western industrialized environment is the source of the profound mismatch, the noxious stressor, as the research calls it, then the cultural mechanisms we are about to discuss serve as adaptive traits for psychological resilience.
They're filling the gap left by our outdated biological programming.
It's like cultural evolution is stepping up where biological evolution failed to keep pace. That brings us to our first mechanism, Ganbat.
Ganbat is a cornerstone of Japanese cultural psychology. It defines a unique mode of tenacity and perseverance, providing a necessary counterpoint to the relentless social and economic pressures of modern Japanese society.
The word Ganbaro, it's often too simplistically translated as do your best. But the sources insist it means so much more. A radical, tenacious persistence.
It carries the weight of to stand firm or to slog on tenaciously through tough times. It's not just about trying hard. It's about full, unwavering commitment to finishing a task and overcoming obstacles, regardless of the difficulty.
So it's a level of sustained effort that this transcends what we might think of as reasonable in a Western context.
It's the sheer force of enduring will, applied actively.
And crucially, the sources differentiate it from gammon.
Yes, that distinction is vital. Gammon is about passive endurance, stoically bearing difficulty without complaint. It's internal patience. Okay? Ganbat, however, is an active, externalized process. It demands continued forward motion, action, visible effort. When you are told to Ganbat, you are being instructed to mobilize your entire being toward the objective.
I find its historical evolution particularly fascinating, moving from a negative trait to a communal rallying cry.
The transformation around the Meiji Restoration in 1868 shows its adaptive power. Originally, Ganbaru had a negative connotation, something like stubbornness or to be obstinate.
So it wasn't always a virtue.
Not at all. But as Japan rapidly modernized and faced immense internal and external pressures, the concept was rearticulated into the powerful, positive societal value we recognize today. The persistence required to overcome insurmountable odds.
It became a tool for national cohesion.
Exactly. And we see this most vividly during national crises.
Right.
Ganbat functions as a fundamental tool for communal rebuilding. After the catastrophic 1995 earthquake in Kobe, the rallying slogan, Gamero Kobe, wasn't just a feel-good message.
It was an instruction.
It was an instruction for collective labor and tenacious dedication to restoration. Similarly, after the 2011 Tushoku earthquake and tsunami, Ganbaru was heard everywhere. It provided a powerful psychological scaffold for people facing total loss.
It connects personal effort to these larger philosophical traditions too, like Zen Buddhism.
Absolutely, where intense personal discipline and effort are central to spiritual development.
This cultural ethic, this demand for relentless persistence, is something that has to be internalized early and profoundly to be so effective. And the sources get extremely detailed about how this is instilled, using the incredibly intimate example of pregnancy and childbirth.
Yes, the customs surrounding Japanese maternity care act as a cultural proving ground for Ganbaru. Locally, pregnancy is conceptualized as a critical period of intense mental and physical discipline where the woman is not passively waiting.
She's actively making their babies.
Exactly. This means the outcome, the health of the child, is viewed as deeply tied to the pregnant woman's conduct and self-control. She's held personally responsible for minimizing risks.
Wow. That shifts the burden of biological risk onto the individual's moral discipline. It's an intensely high-stakes application of Ganbat.
It is. And this manifests in specific, almost austere disciplinary practices. For instance, the cultural norm dictates extremely strict weight gain limits, often no more than 10 kilograms or about 22 pounds throughout the entire pregnancy.
22 pounds for the whole pregnancy, that's
It's incredibly rigorous. If a woman exceeds this goal, she is frequently reprimanded by doctors with the explicit instruction to try harder. They're often required to do daily self-weighing, transforming the physical process into a measurable, disciplined, moral task.
That seems almost punitive from a Western perspective that prioritizes maternal comfort and autonomy. The cultural acceptance of this must mean the perceived benefit is monumental.
The benefit culturally is the successful demonstration of commitment, responsibility, and persistence, which are deemed essential for the mother-child bond. This discipline is seen as preparing the mother for the immense responsibility of child rearing.
And this ethic continues right through labor.
Particularly concerning pain.
Yes. The sources note the pervasive cultural discouragement of pharmacological pain management. Epidurals, which are standard in much of the West, are rare in primary and secondary Japanese hospitals.
And the reason is philosophical, rooted in Ganbaru. There's a strong cultural belief that the act of enduring the pain of labor, of actively persisting through that profound physical challenge, strengthens the nascent bond between mother and child.
So the pain is functional.
It's viewed as a demonstration of the woman's commitment and strength. The pain is not an affliction to be mitigated. It is a functional, transformative step.
That completely flips the script. Pain, in this context, is not a signal of something wrong, but a necessary crucible for forging psychological and relational strengths.
And that endurance is managed in the labor room itself. Laboring women are expected to maintain composure using breathing techniques and movement. Making loud sounds, screaming, is generally considered inappropriate.
And they're coached to be quiet.
They're often gently instructed to stay quiet and focused. The pressure is on the individual to mobilize their internal resources, their Ganbat, to complete the task with dignity and discipline.
So we've established Ganbat as this mechanism of disciplined individual tenacity, applied fiercely. But persistence often fails if it's purely individual.
Right.
The next cultural mechanism, Kapwa, shows us how that individual effort is integrated and amplified by a profound sense of collective interconnectedness. It is the very definition of a strengths-based collective adaptive mechanism.
Kapwa, Kapwa. It's the cornerstone of indigenous Philippine psychology, Psikologiyang Pilipino. And we're not talking about community support in a casual sense.
No.
Kapwa means shared self, or a recognition of shared identity. It is the powerful philosophical idea that, at a fundamental level, your soul and mine are fundamentally connected.
That moves beyond mere empathy or sympathy and into ontology, the nature of being. The self isn't an island. The self is inherently collective.
Exactly. This belief system functions as a highly adaptive mechanism that connects the individual not just to the immediate community and culture, but also to place, environment, history, even spiritual forces.
So when the self is shared,
the drive for self-preservation automatically includes the preservation of the group, which dramatically mitigates the fitness costs of social exclusion and strengthens reciprocal altruism.
How does that deep-seated collective identity translate into practical social interaction and behavior?
It generates the concept of pakikipagkapwa, which is the practice of relating to others. It demands that you accept and deal with the other person as an equal, a kapwa-tao, or fellow human being.
It's a foundational ethical requirement.
It is. It demands respect for the intrinsic dignity of every person, regardless of their social standing, wealth, or power.
So the company president and the janitor must approach each other from a philosophical standpoint of shared selfhood.
That's the ideal logic. And the nuances of pakikipagkapwa are fascinating because they denote increasing degrees of depth in interpersonal engagement. It progresses from basic civility, or pakikitungo, to socializing, pakikisalamuha, all the way to deeper levels like joining in, pakikilhok, and ultimately to pakikisa oneness, or total fusion.
It's a whole architecture for building solidarity.
The very sophisticated one.
This sounds like a mechanism built for resilience. If an individual is struggling with the pressures of the external environment, that evolutionary mismatch we discussed, that struggle is immediately metabolized by a collective that is fundamentally connected to them.
It provides immense psychological and functional strength. When efforts are rooted in Kapwa, individual purpose is nested within the collective soul. This shared purpose often results in more beautiful, effective, and sustainable outcomes.
But the sources make it clear that this indigenous strength was a direct target of historical oppression. Colonialism sought to compromise Kapwa.
That is the tragedy. Multiple colonizers recognized the strength and cohesion of this indigenous value system. To subjugate and maintain control, they actively undermined Kapwa and replaced it with an alternative colonial value, hia, or shame.
Shame.
Hia became central to colonial control because it enforces social boundaries and encourages deference to imposed external authorities, replacing that internal logic of shared equality.
So hia shame served as a psychological weapon, forcing individuals to prioritize external appearance and hierarchical position over shared being.
Precisely. And this historical trauma leaves a psychological residue that persists today in the form of internalized oppression. This is why the movement to revive Kapwa is so revolutionary.
Critical Kapwa pedagogy.
It's a strategic effort, particularly among Filipino-American scholars and youth, to re-articulate this indigenous value. It aims to revolutionize not just ideology, but epistemology, the very nature of knowledge and spirituality, to combat the daily manifestations of this residual hegemonic trauma.
As an act of collective healing.
It
This concept of solidarity, rooted in the shared soul, clearly extends beyond the Filipino community itself.
Absolutely. The historical record shows the Filipino-American community has consistently demonstrated this principle of Kapwa solidarity by building deep, active alliances with other marginalized groups, African Americans, Latinx folks, indigenous communities.
From the labor movement to civil rights?
Exactly. It shows its broader applicability as a sophisticated adaptive mechanism for coalition building and collective survival.
We've framed the problem, the environmental stress of evolutionary mismatch, and we've identified the powerful cultural solutions, the tenacity of Ganbat and the collective soul of Kapwa. Now we have to test how these cultural strengths actually play out in the messy reality of modern life, especially when confronting racial discrimination.
Right.
Does a strong cultural identity always act as that impenetrable shield?
That's the billion-dollar question that empirical research sought to answer. We turn now to a major national study using the NESARC-3 data, which provided a robust platform to directly test this. We already know from vast research that discrimination is a primary noxious stressor.
It's a strong predictor of mood, anxiety, substance use disorders.
Yes. What we don't know is the precise role of identity in that interaction.
The study had to resolve two conflicting theoretical models. Tell us about that tension.
The first model is the widely accepted identity as a buffer theory, heavily rooted in social identity theory. This model suggests that group identity provides crucial psychological resources.
Belonging, self-esteem.
All of that. It acts as a cognitive shield. It allows you to attribute negative events to systemic bias rather than personal failure, protecting the self. The in-group becomes a refuge.
That aligns perfectly with the common sense assumption that cultural pride helps you withstand external pressure. But the second model, the exacerbator model, introduces a brutal psychological paradox.
It does. The second model views identity as an exacerbator, citing a theory of identity-relevant stressors. This theory posits that the more salient or highly valued an identity is,
which for many minority individuals, ethnic identity
is deeply valued, the more psychologically damaging a threat directed at that identity will be. If you pour your strength and self-worth into your identity, a discriminatory act is not just an insult, it's a profound threat to your core being.
So the pain is magnified.
Exactly.
So depending on the group, the same strength could either protect you or make the wound deeper. Which model was supported by the national data?
The data delivered a non-universal, complex answer. Overall, racial discrimination is uniformly a risk factor for psychiatric disorders. And overall, racial ethnic identity is generally a protective factor.
But the interaction?
The specific role of identity when facing discrimination is highly conditional. It depends on the level of identity and the specific racial or ethnic group.
Okay, let's break down those conditional findings. Where did they observe the desired buffer effect?
The buffering effect was observed specifically at a moderate level of racial ethnic identity, but not high identity, for two major groups.
Moderate. That's a key detail.
It is. For Asian Americans, a moderate identity significantly attenuated the link between racial discrimination and mood disorders, like depression. For Black individuals, moderate identity provided a buffer against the link between discrimination and substance use disorders.
That is a crucial nuance. Protection is found in the moderate, well-integrated identity, suggesting that extreme investment, even if positive, might not be the most stable defense mechanism.
Right.
Now, where did identity act as an exacerbator? Where does strong identity intensify the pain?
The exacerbating effect was consistently tied to a high level of racial ethnic identity for three distinct groups. High identity was found to significantly intensify the mental burden of discrimination for whites, linked to substance use disorders. For American Indians, Alaska Natives, AINs, linked to mood disorders, and for Latinx, linked to anxiety disorders. In these cases, the high valuation and deep investment in the ethnic identity appeared to increase susceptibility.
This is a devastating finding. It implies that for a person in the AIN community, investing heavily in a highly valued, often embattled identity, actually made them more vulnerable to developing major depressive episodes when facing a discriminatory event.
It's a profound and difficult finding.
We have to explore why these effects differ so widely across groups and across the type of disorder.
The researchers put forth two compelling hypotheses. The first involves identity development status. The argument here is that the psychological quality of the identity matters more than the sheer quantity.
Okay.
Previous research suggests that the identities of Asian Americans and African Americans are often more achieved, meaning they've gone through a rigorous process of exploration, questioning, and commitment regarding what their racial ethnic group membership means.
And how does an achieved status compare to a less explored one?
When an identity is achieved, it provides individuals with robust cognitive coping mechanisms, often learned through racial socialization in their families and communities. It includes the ability to reframe discriminatory incidents, maintain self-esteem.
So it's a more resilient armor. That helps explain why the moderate identity was protective for Asians and Blacks.
Exactly. Conversely, the less explored identity status often seen in whites and Latinicus, which might be more based on external markers without deep structural examination, lacks those sophisticated coping tools.
Which might explain why high identity in those groups acted as an exacerbator. The valuation is high, but the psychological defense mechanisms are underdeveloped.
Precisely. And the vulnerability of the AIN community is particularly salient here, as their identity is often under severe constant threat. For them, a high commitment to identity may simply mean a heightened awareness of systemic threat.
That brings us to the second hypothesis, which maps cultural grounding directly onto the manifestation of psychological distress, cultural grounding and disorder type.
This hypothesis relates to the fundamental difference between collectivistic and individualistic orientations. We observe that groups often grounded in historically collectivistic cultures, AION, AENs, and Latinx, were more susceptible to internalizing disorders.
Mood and anxiety.
Right. Their response to external threat is to turn the strain inward. The discrimination threatens the collective harmony they value.
And the opposite for individualistic cultures.
Conversely, groups grounded in historically individualistic cultures like whites, or those traditionally found to be more vulnerable to externalizing problems like Black individuals, showed the moderation effect primarily in relation to externalizing disorders such as substance use.
So they turn the strain outward.
Or seek immediate external coping mechanisms to manage the distress. It suggests that culture dictates the language of psychological pain, whether you internalize it as anxiety or externalize it as a behavior, like substance abuse.
That is a complete mapping of cultural context onto psychological outcomes. It helps explain not just if identity helps, but how the trauma expresses itself. Now, there was one final layer to this complexity: the nativity factor.
Yes, the study found that these moderating effects, both the buffering and the exacerbating, were predominantly driven by the U.S.-born population across all racial and ethnic groups.
Wow.
This is a profound finding because it isolates the psychological cost of being integrated into the American racial hierarchy.
So the U.S.-born population is more psychologically invested and therefore more vulnerable.
Precisely. U.S.-born individuals have a greater stake in their American racial ethnic identity. They are acutely aware of American racial categories, historical grievances, the nuances of racism. When discrimination occurs, it threatens an identity they have built their life around.
Whereas foreign-born immigrants,
they often maintain their primary identity connection to their country of origin. This relative psychological distance from American racial categorization, coupled with stronger cultural affirmation from their homeland, seems to provide a baseline buffer.
that suggests a brutal irony. The process of acculturation, of becoming more aware and invested in the American identity, also increases one's psychological vulnerability to American racial threats.
It's a massive hurdle. It creates a specific need for targeted racial socialization strategies for U.S.-born individuals, helping them achieve that resilient, moderate, and well-explored identity status.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We began by contrasting the Western deficit model with the sheer sophisticated strength of cultural mechanisms like Ganbat and Kapwa. These are clear examples of evolutionary psychology in action.
Cultural persistence mechanisms serving as adaptive traits.
But the data shows that even this incredible cultural resource ethnic identity is not a simple unconditional shield. It is dynamic, conditional, and nonlinear.
That's the core takeaway. The deep dive affirms that racial discrimination is a noxious stressor for everyone, proving the environmental strain. The cultural solutions, the grit, the collective soul, are real, potent, and generally protective.
But the empirical findings demand nuance.
Exactly. We cannot simply assume more identity equals more protection.
The implication for mental health is immense. We must shift the focus entirely away from pathology and risk factors and toward cultural resilience. We need to acknowledge and actively support the immense cultural strength encapsulated in concepts like Ganbat and Kapwa.
Yes, these sophisticated strategies for survival that the deficit model utterly ignores. But simultaneously, we must recognize that the psychological benefits of identity are not uniform or linear. Our interventions need to be highly attuned to the specific dynamics within groups.
So for U.S.-born populations, promoting that achieved moderate identity status is key to building that buffer.
We must understand when deep identity acts as a resource and when it can pose a heightened psychological risk by making one too vulnerable to the external environment.
It means the work of healing and thriving relies on bridging that profound gap between the historical wisdom of cultural identity and the complex, targeted challenges of modern life.
These cultural persistence mechanisms are not static relics of the past. They are active, ongoing, adaptive survival strategies in a world that is constantly testing the human spirit.
The ability to leverage the collective soul of Kapwa, or the dedicated tenacity of Ganbat, is what allows individuals to persist against pressures that were never part of our original biological design. And as we close this deep dive, it brings to mind an old Tagalog proverb, which perfectly encapsulates the power of acknowledging the past and persisting toward the future. It speaks directly to the need to anchor ourselves in that cultural DNA to move forward.
Ang hindi marunong lumingon sa pinanggalingan ay hindi makakarating sa parurungan. One who does not look back at their past will not reach their destination.